The order came without warning. Overnight, every man of military age in Russia found himself digitally shackled. Airport gates closed, land borders sealed, and the government's online portal, Gosuslugi, turned from a civilian service into a mobilization weapon. Moscow called it national defense, but in truth it was the fear of a ruler cornered by his own war. 3 years of relentless attrition had drained Russia's army to the bone. Once described as one of the world's largest military forces, it had become a ghostly shadow of its former self. Western intelligence estimated over 1 million casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. Thousands of tanks lay wrecked across the Ukrainian steppe, while the elite Storm Z penal battalions made of convicts promised freedom had been annihilated in suicidal assaults. Even the mercenary channels that once boasted of victories had gone silent. Putin's panic translated into policy. Facing shortages on every front, soldiers' ammunition and legitimacy, the Kremlin secretly launched a plan to call up 2 million reservists. According to leaked documents cited by Ukrainian intelligence, the Ministry of Defense had built a new digital mobilization network, capable of tracking every eligible male citizen within seconds. The FSB's border database was synchronized with draft orders, an invisible wall that could imprison millions without a single soldier patrolling the border. But this was not simply a military maneuver. It was a declaration of distrust between a state and its people. The Kremlin no longer believed its citizens would answer the patriotic call. They had to be trapped. From a social perspective, this iron lockdown struck hardest at the peripheries places like Dagestan, Buryatia, and Tuva. These minority republics had already carried a disproportionate share of the war's casualties. Reports from BBC and independent Russian outlets in exile revealed that per capita death rates in Buryatia were nearly 30 times higher than in Moscow. In poor rural regions, draft officers went door to door, seizing men as if harvesting lives, while the capital's elite districts remained untouched. The Kremlin's promise of equal sacrifice had become a moral fraud. As analysts in Military Watch magazine observed, this divide revealed the feudal structure of Putin's war economy. Wealth bought protection. Poverty bought a coffin. The sons of Moscow's oligarchs flew to Dubai, while the sons of Siberia were flown to the Donbass. The Kremlin's silence on this injustice, the appalling silence as one Russian sociologist called it, deepened the anger now spreading quietly through towns and villages. At the same time, political cracks began to show. The digital border closures sparked chaos at airports from St. Petersburg to Vladikavkaz. Telegram channels used by anti-mobilization activists exploded overnight, circulating maps of escape routes through Kazakhstan and Georgia before the borders fully shut. The Soldiers' Mothers movement, which had grown slowly since 2023, now flooded social media with images of missing sons, military hospitals overflowing, and desperate letters smuggled from the front. Women were turning moral outrage into organized dissent, a soft pressure that even Moscow's censors struggled to suppress. Yet the demographic consequences were equally devastating. By 2025, Russia had already lost nearly 500,000 men under 30 to death, injury, or emigration. The new mobilization trap risked eliminating what demographers called the nation's last healthy generation. With birth rates at post-Soviet lows and emigration surging among professionals, experts warned that the country faced a double: bleeding soldiers vanishing at the front, and engineers, doctors, and IT workers fleeing or hiding. Putin's digital Iron Curtain, meant to project strength, revealed fragility instead. No longer could the Kremlin rely on patriotic myth or economic comfort. The illusion of unity had been replaced by compulsion. The Russian state was not protecting its people. It was imprisoning them. And as the walls of this digital prison tightened, One question began to echo through Russia's locked borders and silent cities: how long before fear turns into defiance? The panic gripping the Kremlin in late 2025 was not born overnight. It was the ghost of September 2022, the moment Russia's war machine first cracked under its own weight. That autumn, Vladimir Putin announced what he called a partial mobilization. It was supposed to save his faltering offensive in Ukraine. Instead, it triggered one of the largest peacetime exoduses in modern Russian history. Within weeks, an estimated 260,000 men, engineers, students, doctors, truck drivers, vanished across Russia's borders. Flights to Yerevan, Tbilisi, and Istanbul sold out in hours. Cars jammed the Georgian frontier for miles, engines running, men sleeping in their vehicles just to escape the draft. The images broadcast by foreign media humiliated the Kremlin. Instead of rushing to enlist young Russians, were running from their own army. This humiliation seared itself into the state's memory. To Putin and his circle, it represented not just a military failure, but a personal betrayal. The propaganda that once proclaimed the people and the army are one collapsed overnight. The government had discovered the limits of its own myth. 3 years later, the leadership swore it would never happen again. But as Russia's war losses mounted, history repeated itself, only this time with higher stakes and tighter walls. From a social perspective, the inequalities behind that first mobilization had grown wider. Data gathered by independent demographers showed that in Moscow and St. Petersburg, draft centers called up less than 0.1% of eligible men. Meanwhile, in Buryatia and Dagestan, entire neighborhoods were stripped of their male population. Analysts described these regions as blood donors for the Kremlin's geopolitical ambitions, sacrificing sons for a cause from which they derived no benefit. The resentment simmering there has now turned into silent defiance. In rural towns across the Caucasus, families communicate through coded telegram messages, warning each other of approaching draft officers. In Siberia, women have formed small anonymous groups that exchange forged medical certificates and fake employment records to keep men off the mobilization lists. These small acts of survival, multiplied across thousands of households, amount to a decentralized protest, one that the state cannot easily crush because it is rooted in necessity, not ideology. From the political perspective, 2022 also marked the first breach in the Kremlin's control of information. The rise of encrypted messaging channels shattered Moscow's monopoly on narrative. Soldiers' wives and mothers began sharing photos of body bags arriving at regional airports. Videos of chaotic mobilization offices, where terrified men were handed rifles from the 1970s, spread faster than censorship could block them. In Dagestan, women confronted police officers directly shouting, "This is not our war scenes," that resonated far beyond their local borders. Now in 2025, that network has matured. These same mothers have become the voice of a silent opposition, non-political, moral, and impossible to delegitimize. Their grief has turned into leverage. Every coffin returned from the front is a small act of indictment. Each protest that the state tries to suppress creates ripples of sympathy across the Federation. But perhaps the deepest wound lies in the demographic perspective. The 2022 mobilization not only drained Russia's human capital, it accelerated the country's long-term decline. According to economists cited by Defense News, Russia lost more than $70 billion in productivity between 2022 and 2024 due to skilled workers fleeing abroad. The government tried to replace them with convicts, foreign laborers, and automation, none of which could fill the gap. Birth rates plummeted further as young couples either emigrated or postponed having children. For a nation already facing a shrinking labor force, this demographic echo became an existential threat. By 2025, those same men who fled 3 years earlier had built new lives in exile, contributing to the economies of Georgia, Armenia, and the EU. Many continued remote work for Western companies, effectively transferring Russia's intellectual wealth abroad. Inside the country, however, fear replaced talent. The Kremlin's response to lock the doors and force a new mobilization was a short-term fix that deepened a long-term wound. As one Russian political analyst now in exile put it, "The Kremlin can trap bodies, but it cannot command minds." And as Russia repeats the mistakes of 2022, only one question remains: when will those trapped bodies decide to break the cage? For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin's rule rested not on fear alone, but on an unwritten deal, a silent understanding between ruler and ruled. Russians would stay out of politics, and in return the state would guarantee stability, rising living standards, and national pride. It was the bargain that turned the chaos of the 1990s into the fortress of stability myth. But in 2025, that fortress has collapsed from within. The new digital lockdown, the iron trap, marked the end of that contract. The Kremlin no longer offered protection. It demanded obedience. The promise of security, the core of Putin's legitimacy, has been broken. For millions of Russians, the state has transformed from a provider into a captor. The social consequences of this betrayal are staggering. In Moscow's elite districts, life continues, almost normally. Cafes are full, luxury boutiques still import French perfume through parallel trade, and the children of officials post photos from Turkey and Dubai. But travel bans now keep ordinary men, especially from rural and minority regions, prisoners within their own country. According to leaked regional data, more than 70% of new conscription orders have been issued in provinces far from the capital. This is not a coincidence. It is policy. The Kremlin has learned that the safest soldiers to mobilize are those with the least voice. Villages in Dagestan, Buryatia, and Tuva report losing entire age groups to the front. One local teacher from Makhachkala described the mobilization as a death tax on the poor. Meanwhile, the middle class of Moscow and St. Petersburg remains largely untouched, shielded by wealth and connections. The inequality of sacrifice, the exploitation of the periphery, has turned the war into a class and ethnic conflict inside Russia itself. From a political perspective, this breaking of the social contract has produced a quiet but potent kind of rebellion. There are few open protests, the police ensure that. Instead, there is passive resistance, disappearing workers, fake documents, and bureaucratic sabotage. Military recruitment offices are mysteriously set on fire in dozens of regions each month. Online networks of volunteers help potential conscripts forge medical exemptions or escape internal checkpoints. Each act may be small, but together they represent a system-wide refusal to cooperate. Even within the bureaucracy, cracks are widening. Some regional governors, alarmed by the potential backlash, quietly delay mobilization quotas. Officials leak information to journalists or sympathetic telegram channels. The Soldiers' Mothers movement, once dismissed as marginal, now acts as a moral compass for a society stripped of its voice. Their statements, amplified by online exiles, have turned grief into a weapon of truth that even state TV cannot fully silence. But perhaps the most devastating rupture lies in the demographic perspective. The Kremlin's obsession with control has created what demographers describe as a self-inflicted extinction spiral. Every new mobilization order accelerates the loss of productive citizens. Russia's Federal Statistics Service reported a record population decline of over 1 million people in 2024 alone, the steepest in post-Soviet history. Birth rates have fallen to half of what they were in 2014. The combination of war deaths, migration, and social fear has crippled the nation's demographic future. A generation of young Russians, engineers, doctors, programmers, now face a cruel paradox. Those who leave are branded traitors, and those who stay risk dying for a war they do not believe in. Many are withdrawing inward, refusing to marry, or have children unwilling to build a future in a country where the state might seize their sons next. As sociologist Elena Kolesnikova remarked in a recent exile interview, Russia is not just losing people, it is losing hope. This erosion of hope is the ultimate betrayal of the Putin era. The man who once promised to restore national dignity has instead trapped his nation in fear and decline. The contract that held the regime together, obedience in exchange for stability, no longer exists. What remains is coercion. And coercion, history shows, can sustain power but never trust. The question haunting the Kremlin now is not whether the social contract is broken, but when the anger beneath the silence will erupt. What began as silent obedience is now turning into silent rebellion. Across Russia's vast landscape, from the frozen tundra of Yakutia to the crowded suburbs of Moscow, a quiet resistance is taking root. It does not march in the streets or chant slogans in Red Square. Instead, it hides in plain sight in falsified medical certificates, in bribes passed to corrupt draft officers, in men vanishing from workplaces, and in families learning how to live off the grid. The government calls it draft evasion. But in truth, it is the only form of survival left for millions. The iron trap that closed in 2025 didn't just lock borders, it shattered trust between the people and the state. From the social perspective, this underground rebellion exposes the deep fracture between Russia's privileged center and its abandoned periphery. In the towns of Buryatia, local NGOs report that more than 1 in 5 men under 30 has either been drafted or disappeared. Entire communities are collapsing, farms left untended, classrooms empty, small factories shut down for lack of workers. In Moscow, however, young men find refuge in state bureaucracy or private companies with ties to the defense sector, a modern version of draft immunity bought with wealth or influence. This inequality fuels a bitterness that no propaganda can disguise. For every staged photo of patriotic volunteers, there are hundreds of real families mourning sons forced to die in muddy trenches. Regional journalists, often working anonymously, document how impoverished families are offered cash bonuses to send relatives to war, only to receive death notices months later and unpaid compensation. The Kremlin's exploitation of the poor has become systemic, a conveyor belt of despair feeding the front lines. But it is through the political perspective that the resistance becomes visible. While public protests remain rare due to mass arrests, small and symbolic acts of defiance have multiplied. In early 2025, more than 60 recruitment centers across Russia were set ablaze, attacks often carried out by individuals with no clear political ties. Telegram channels such as Go by the Forest and Idite Lesum serve as digital lifelines, teaching men how to avoid the draft, how to disable tracking apps, and how to cross internal borders unnoticed. The Soldiers' Mothers movement has evolved into a nationwide moral opposition. These women do not shout against Putin directly. They do something far more dangerous. They tell the truth. Their testimonies about abuse, corruption, and mass graves at the front pierce through the government's censorship armor. They record phone calls with their missing sons' commanders, circulate letters from wounded soldiers, and demand answers in open court. Authorities fear them precisely because they cannot be easily labeled as foreign agents. They are not activists, they are mothers, and their grief carries a power stronger than ideology. Inside, the military cracks of defiance are spreading. Reports from Ukrainian intelligence and open-source trackers indicate that desertions have reached alarming levels, more than 25,000 soldiers in one region alone. By late 2025, some estimates predicted that 70,000 would have deserted nationwide. Entire units, under-equipped and demoralized, are refusing to fight. Videos have emerged of Russian soldiers surrendering en masse or deliberately sabotaging their own vehicles. Commanders respond with brutality, summary executions, threats against families, and fear-based discipline. Yet these measures only deepen the sense that the army itself is rotting from within. From the demographic perspective, this resistance has profound implications. As men hide or flee the civilian economy, hemorrhages workers. In rural areas, women now form the backbone of agricultural and service industries. Factories report chronic shortages of skilled labor. Medical clinics are staffed by retirees. The generational chain that sustained Russian industry since the Soviet era is breaking. The government's attempt to replenish its army is paradoxically destroying the social and economic fabric it needs to survive. One Western defense analyst recently described it as a society consuming its own future to prolong its present. The Kremlin's repression may silence dissent temporarily, but it cannot erase the moral erosion spreading through its own ranks. The regime now rules through fear, not faith, and that transformation marks the beginning of decline. Russia's hidden resistance is not yet a revolution, but it is a warning, a quiet hum beneath the noise of propaganda, signaling that the machinery of control is beginning to rust. And as more soldiers desert, more mothers speak, and more men vanish into hiding, one haunting question lingers: when does silence itself become an act of rebellion? The Kremlin's obsession with control has now become an act of self-destruction. What began as a mobilization crisis has evolved into an economic catastrophe that no sanction could ever achieve. Factories stall, logistics collapse, and entire industries run short of men to operate them. Russia's war effort, once sustained by oil revenues and cheap labor, is devouring the very foundation of its own economy. The so-called brain drain that followed the first mobilization in 2022 has turned into something far worse: a brain lockdown. Where the earlier exodus saw hundreds of thousands flee to Armenia, Georgia, and the EU, the new digital iron trap has imprisoned those who remain. Trapped inside the country, the same engineers, doctors, and IT specialists now face an impossible choice: serve at the front, hide, or stop working altogether. From a social perspective, this paralysis is reshaping daily life. In provincial cities such as Perm, Irkutsk, and Samara, businesses report that nearly 1/3 of their male staff have gone missing, either mobilized or in hiding. Trucking companies can't find drivers. Hospitals lack surgeons. Schools struggle to replace male teachers drafted into the army. Local economies built on fragile post-Soviet infrastructure are grinding to a halt. Yet in Moscow's glittering center, the state projects a false image of stability. The Kremlin funnels funds into parades, propaganda films, and luxury developments, while bread prices quietly rise and regional markets empty. The inequality between the metropole and the provinces, always wide, has become an unbridgeable chasm. In this fractured reality, resentment festers. Small shop owners whisper that Putin's war has taken our sons and our business. The very same social contract that once traded obedience for prosperity has collapsed into survival mode. Families now hoard food and fuel distrust officials, and depend on informal networks for everything from medicine to money transfers. For the majority of Russians outside the elite circle, the war's economic burden feels like a form of internal colonization, the center enriching itself while the periphery bleeds dry. From a political perspective, the economic decay is corroding the Kremlin's control. Regional governors struggling to maintain production are quietly defying federal orders. In some areas, military quotas have been delayed under the pretext of labor shortages. Local police turn a blind eye to draft dodgers because factories cannot afford to lose more workers. Telegram channels circulate leaked government memos warning of potential strikes in transportation hubs. Even loyalist oligarchs complain in private that Western sanctions are less destructive than the government's own mobilization policies. Western economists note a striking pattern. The Kremlin's attempt to replace lost human labor with technology and migrant workers is failing. Industrial automation cannot keep pace with wartime demand, and foreign recruits from Asia and Africa hastily hired for construction or frontline support lack the skills to sustain complex sectors like energy or defense production. A report by Defense News in October 2025 revealed that tank and missile factories are operating at only 60% capacity, not due to lack of resources, but because there are no qualified engineers left to run them. From the demographic perspective, the long-term damage is irreversible. Russia is experiencing what demographers call a double collapse, both reproductive and productive. The loss of young men to war and flight has left a gaping hole in the labor market that no future generation can fill. Fertility rates have dropped below 1.3 children per woman, one of the lowest in the world. Sociologists warn that within 2 decades, Russia could lose up to 10 million working-age citizens, creating an economic vacuum comparable to the aftermath of the Second World War. The pension system is already showing strain as tax revenues shrink. Analysts at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, one of the last remaining semi-independent institutions, estimate that the state's war spending now consumes over 40% of the national budget. Inflation quietly erodes real incomes. The ruble's temporary stability maintained through strict capital controls hides a deeper rot: falling productivity, broken supply chains, and mass corruption siphoning off what little wealth remains. The irony is brutal. The Kremlin once claimed it was fighting for Russia's sovereignty to defend its economy from Western influence. Yet now it has built an economy dependent on fear and deception. An economy where skilled workers hide, not produce, where officials falsify data to avoid punishment, and where patriotism is measured not by achievement, but by silence. One Western analyst put it bluntly: the Kremlin has nationalized its own failure. The more it tries to control, the faster the system disintegrates. The Russian economy may not collapse overnight, but like the empire that preceded it, it is dying from within. Factories may keep their lights on, but the hum of production has been replaced by the echo of absence. And as empty trains, idle at depots, and unharvested crops rot in frozen fields, one question grows louder: how long can a state survive when its people stop believing in work, in future, or in victory? The Iron Trap was supposed to prevent rebellion. Instead, it created the conditions for one. By locking millions of young men inside Russia and stripping them of freedom, hope, and livelihood, the Kremlin has turned an anxious nation into a powder keg. The pressure builds in silence, invisible, until the moment it explodes. What makes this situation uniquely dangerous is the convergence of 3 forces: social despair, political fracture, and demographic decay, all colliding at once. Every one of these forces feeds the other, accelerating Russia's internal unraveling faster than the Kremlin can contain it. From the social perspective, the despair is everywhere. Men of fighting age live in fear of the knock at the door. Mothers whisper prayers that their sons' names won't appear on new mobilization lists. Regional economies are hollowed out, and in cities like Ulan-Ude and Makhachkala, unemployment and funerals rise side by side. A BBC field report this autumn showed that in parts of Dagestan, entire villages are populated almost entirely by women and the elderly. The state's silence on this suffering, its appalling silence as critics describe it, has become a moral wound that no propaganda can heal. Meanwhile, the few remaining urban professionals, engineers, teachers, and programmers live in quiet rebellion. Some pretend to work but sabotage state projects from within. Others delete digital records to escape the draft. In a country that once prized silent obedience, the greatest act of defiance is now simple non-compliance. From the political perspective, the Kremlin's control is beginning to crack in new, unpredictable ways. The mass exodus of 2022 acted as a safety valve, releasing the anger of those most likely to revolt. But now the borders are sealed. The angry remain trapped, disillusioned, and connected through encrypted channels that the state cannot fully suppress. The Soldiers' Mothers movement and allied networks of wives, sisters, and widows are expanding faster than any official organization can monitor. What began as isolated appeals for missing soldiers has become a decentralized moral front. These women coordinate across regions from Dagestan to Irkutsk, bypassing censorship through coded language. Their influence terrifies officials because it transcends ideology. They do not argue politics, they demand accountability. Each unanswered death, each closed casket becomes an accusation against the regime itself. Even loyal officials are growing uneasy. According to insiders cited by independent outlets in exile, some regional governors are privately warning the Kremlin that another mobilization could trigger open unrest. The FSB has ramped up surveillance of local administrations, fearing betrayal from within. In Moscow, paranoia reigns. Officials reshuffle ministries not to increase efficiency, but to prevent conspiracies. The Kremlin's fear of its own bureaucracy mirrors its fear of its own army, both riddled with resentment and fatigue. And beneath all of this lies the demographic bomb, the slowest but most unstoppable threat of all. By 2025, Russia's population has fallen below 140 million for the first time in modern history. Military-aged men are disappearing faster than they can be replaced. Birth rates have collapsed to historic lows. Emigration continues quietly, despite closed borders, as thousands slip through unofficial crossings into Central Asia each month. Experts call this the double bleeding, the simultaneous loss of soldiers and specialists. Without young workers, the pension system collapses. Without engineers, the defense industry stalls. Without hope, the birth rate withers. The next generation of Russians, if they remain, will inherit a country drained of youth trust and purpose. And so the rebellion equation is complete. The social injustice of the periphery, the political erosion of control, and the demographic implosion of the nation combine into a single volatile force. What happens when millions of trapped, hopeless men realize they have nothing left to lose? Already the first signs of unrest flicker beneath the surface. In Dagestan and Buryatia, local protests flare whenever new mobilization lists appear. Railway lines are sabotaged in Siberia. Supply depots mysteriously burn in Belgorod. The Kremlin blames foreign agents, but even internal security officers admit privately that many incidents are spontaneous acts of despair, not conspiracy. Western analysts describe this as the 1917 paradox, when the state obsessed with victory abroad loses control at home. Putin's digital fortress, designed to preserve power, has instead become an open-air prison where fear breeds defiance. The moment that fear turns to rage, repression will no longer suffice. And so Russia stands on a knife's edge. A nation that sought unity through war now faces disintegration from within. The same iron walls built to contain the enemy have begun to trap the regime itself. In the end, Putin's greatest miscalculation may not be the invasion of Ukraine, but the war he has ignited inside his own borders. For now, the question that haunts both the Kremlin and the world is simple. When will the silence break, and who will strike the first blow?